CCCM acted northeast Syria. We've got Lauren McCarthy. She's CCCM Technical Coordinator, Yemen, and Mahmoud Naif, CCCM Field Officer, South Sudan. I think Mahmoud has finally joined us. So Mahmoud, welcome. Now, we will not be able to discuss this alone without inviting other colleagues. So we've taken the opportunity to invite someone from the protection cluster, and this is Bruno Stolz, UNHCR in Iraq, and the non-access expert, Tom Robinson, with a global access advisor with the NRC. Now, the agenda today is in 3 parts. One, we will hear challenges and the particular best practices in northeast Syria, northwest Syria, Yemen, and South Sudan as a first part. We will then transition to how camp management agencies ensure a balanced and principled approach in responding to the needs of people in these areas, where the special focus on mainstreaming protection, and then teasing out the key access and engagement best practices out there that work. We'll then finally have a Q&A, and this provides us an opportunity to table some of the key concerns we may have. Let me remind you that after each session or presentation, we will have 2 very quick questions to keep the momentum running. And for that matter, I will request that each individual speaks at a time so that we don't lose comments. And then obviously opinions are what they are. We will respect opinions as long as they do not cross the line. And finally, there will be an opportunity for every one of you, even after the webinar, to share your concerns and key questions that we can table later. This email will be shared by Veronica. So that's how it's going to be. I will now request northwestern Syria, and this is Adnan. Adnan.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ronald. Thank you very much, Veronica. I will just start sharing my screen. One moment. Okay. Can you see it? Sorry, can you see?
I guess Veronica has to remove her screen.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. Yeah, I think I started sharing, so it would be good to get the feedback if everybody can see the screen.
We can see the screen.
Yes? Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. So yeah, very happy about this webinar because I think that CCM has a lot of, I think it's very interwoven with the question of humanitarian access, and especially that CCM, I mean, we work in camps, camp-like settings, so it's static humanitarian facilities, much more vulnerable than also to access constraints and challenges. And whether it's whether it's about access challenges regarding security or also violations of humanitarian principles and meaningful humanitarian access. So I think it's very important to discuss, and also a lot of these access challenges were again compounded by this COVID-19 challenge and response. So looking forward to also hear from the other participants and also have this shared learning experience. So first of all, about the Northwest Syria context. I'm trying to switch to the next slide. Okay, wonderful. So it's quite a complicated context. So I thought just to give a very short brief before going into the main topic. So you can see here a map of Northwest Syria. What is colored in blue is northern Aleppo. This is the Turkish-influenced area. Colored in green, you can see Idlib. This is now under control of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. It's a proscribed terrorist organization with the civilian arm, the Syrian Salvation Government. This is its civilian arm. They have even a ministry for for humanitarian affairs and development. So quite organized. And of course, this comes also with its specific access challenges then, and specifically for CCM. You can see in red here, this is the government of Syria controlled area, and in yellow, the Kurdish controlled area. This mainly the humanitarian operations in northwest Syria cover the Turkey influenced area and the HTS controlled area. It's just very important to keep also in mind those other areas, because of course there are continuous tensions because ongoing military operations. The last military operation lasted from December to March. Now we're having a ceasefire. However, the ceasefire is quite quite fragile, we can say. There are continuous breaches of this ceasefire. So this has also, of course, its impact on the overall humanitarian operation. Not to take too long, let's go into the Ccm operational context now. We can see that we have overall 1.3 million IDPs living in Idp sites. Here we can see they are living in more than 884 IDP sites, around 250,000 families. We can see that the concentration of camps, you can see that here in Dana, northern Idlib, there is the highest concentration of camps. This is because the displacement movement, the most recent displacement movement, mainly occurred from southern Idlib and eastern Idlib towards this northern Idlib area. We can see also some of the camps in the Aleppo area, in the Turkey-influenced area, but it's less in comparison to Idlib. We can say around 20%, 25% of the IDP sites, they are located in the Euphrates Shield and the Aleppo area. Now, a breakdown of those IDP sites. We can see that more than 800 of these sites are informal settlements, informal IDP sites. Now, there are a lot of factors that played into this and that can explain this phenomenon. So it's not to take I think this would need maybe a own webinar. But one of the main reasons for this is, you can see here down in the sites population chart, the extreme increase in displacement, in the displacement figure. Now we have more than 1.3 million IDPs, and just with the most recent military operation, there were more than 1 million new IDP movements recorded. Of course, not all are moving to camps or camp-like settings, but around 20 to 25% they moved to camps. So just with the most recent military operation, we had an increase of 400,000, more than 400,000 additional IDPs in those camp-like settings. And then very often, what do IDPs do? They would just find some spot of land, get into an own agreement with the landlord or whomever, and just set up an informal IDP site. We can see this also reflected in the HLP status. More than from around 90% is not really a valid HLP status, meaning that not really HLP criteria are applying. And also here, the site's land ownership, we see that more than 60% of the lands are private. So this is, of course, extremely challenging, comes with a lot of protection challenges, with a lot of humanitarian access challenges. And there's someone, I think someone has to mute. I'm hearing key.
You can go ahead, Adnan.
Please go ahead. I think it's Mahmoud trying to join in. He's having some trouble. Please go ahead. From the topography, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going ahead. Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, sorry. It seems I was cut off for a time. Sorry. So here, just to visualize what actually an informal IDP site means. So here we can see a a photo of an informal IDP site. It's an example. Like we can see that no whatsoever humanitarian standards are applying here, no sphere standards. I mean, also from the topography, totally unsuitable. Lots of these informal IDP sites are getting flooded because of the unsuitable topography. Also from the distance of shelters from each other, I mean, lots of protection concerns. Yeah, so not exactly an ideal situation. This is just an example for a planned camp, but this is the total exception. This is the IOM managed planned camp. However, I mean, this is serving 4,000 IDPs, so the majority of IDPs are not really living under these circumstances, conditions. So now going into the topic after this brief overview on context, into the topic of humanitarian access in northwest Syria. So first of all, we have now what is facilitating the overall humanitarian access is a UN Security Council resolution, now being renewed from 2014 on regularly every year. The latest renewal was for 6 months, so the Security Council will reconvene again in June or beginning of July to hopefully extend it, although there are, of course, fears that there might be a Russian veto, and there are also right now contingency plans being prepared for this scenario. So the humanitarian access and aid is mainly facilitated through these 2 border crossings, through Bab el-Salama, this is one crossing from Turkey to northern Aleppo, and through Bab el-Hawa, this is from Turkey to Idlib. And this implies that mainly we're working in a remote management modality. So all the UN agencies also are working through implementing partners. As IOM, we have currently more than 20 partners, around 22 partners in all kinds of sectors, from NFI kit distribution, protection, and so on and so forth. And this remote management modality, of course, means that access constraints and challenges are compounded, and especially for CCCM. So the list is long, so just going into some of the most prevalent access constraints before also going into the COVID-19 related access challenges. Armed hostilities is one of them. Just as I explained already in the introduction when explaining the map, there are continuous armed hostilities. For example, we just lost access to one of our reception centers, which was located in western Aleppo in Mizanaz, and it was this area fell under control of the government of Syria during the last military operation. So we needed to evacuate this reception center, and later on it was even bombed, fortunately, after it was evacuated. So this is just one example, and repeatedly, unfortunately, respect of international humanitarian law is almost non-existent. So repeatedly, CCM sites are being targeted, are being hit. Also, our reception centers that are being notified through a UN OCHA mechanism system, even those are sometimes not safe. So these are not the only challenges we're facing. Then with regards to meaningful enhancement and maintaining meaningful humanitarian access, meaning also in line with humanitarian principles, we have it's continually challenged through several stakeholders, armed groups, local authorities, and we're seeing interference into humanitarian aid modalities, like, for example, interference into the beneficiary selection or into how the program, on what the humanitarian aid should focus, for example, for protection programs. And then also as part of this interference, we're seeing also aid diversion attempts. Some are more obvious than others, we can say, like, for example, when fees are being requested whenever humanitarian aid workers are entering into a camp. Some are more subtle. We can say, like, for example, diversion of humanitarian aid to a specific community. Just to give an example, in the latest identification, like with the latest huge displacement, we were working on identifying sites for new camp establishments. And later we found out that there was already an agreement behind the scenes between the local council and the specific community, and that this site was going to be dedicated to this specific community. So this is also a challenge.
You want to send me the link just in case if yours doesn't work?
Sorry, I think maybe it was just again
Adnan,
muting
Adnan,
problem.
please go.
Yes, I'm going ahead.
Adnan, please
So
go
also
ahead.
we're seeing.
Please go.
Yes, I'm
Go
going
ahead. We
ahead.
request everyone to mute their mics.
Yes, I'm going ahead. So we are also facing bureaucratic impediments, this specifically in the Turkey-controlled areas, and also restriction of movements. I'm seeing that the time is getting we're having here also time constraints, so I'm trying to be faster. And going now to the COVID-19 related response, COVID-19 related access challenges. Of course, I mean, there are lots of COVID-19 measures that are now being applied also in camps, and it was already discussed before, so I'm not going to go here into details like hygiene promotion, social distancing, hygiene kits distribution, etc. When going now into the challenges with regards to access, we can see that there's restrictions for humanitarian staff movement. There was for some time, for example, to move from Idlib to Aleppo or vice versa. Then the extreme congestion of IDP sites. We just mentioned like more than 1.3 million IDPs living extremely close to each other. So almost by default, it means that all kind of COVID-19 preventive measures are very hard to establish. Just as a very quick background, until now, no COVID-19 cases have been detected in northwest Syria, and there's ongoing testing. Until now, facilitated through WHO, there were around more than 250 tests already conducted. Just as a fast background. So it might be that we're seeing an increase in those access challenges once the first COVID-19 case is being detected. Then relocation, especially for reception centers. I mean, reception centers, already in their nature, it's rub halls, 80 to 100 IDPs in a very close space. So we had relocation plans, but then also it's very difficult in the absence of clear local authorities, and in the absence, like the COVID-19 crisis comes on top of a shelter crisis. So it's very difficult to find another place for IDPs to move, as there are not really any camps, for example, where people could be moved to. This also is connected to land issues, like the HLP issues we discussed, and then also lack of camp management structures in the informal IDP sites. So we're not really having formal camp management structures that can implement those COVID-19 measures. Specifically challenging our isolation measures. We see that we need a lot of health support to implement those isolation measures. Others like for example, this shielding approach that was being talked about a lot is totally unrealistic to implement in the northwest Syria context. And mainly the health partners' focus is being now on generally responding to this COVID-19 crisis, like, for example, increasing the capacity of hospitals to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So there is not as much a focus on increasing the COVID-19 preparedness from a health perspective in camps or camp-like settings. So this is where we're also facing a challenge. Community participation after a long trajectory of war, and I mean the Syrian people, the IDPs, they lived now 10 years of war. So some are joking now about COVID-19. They're saying, I was not killed by all these bombs, and now you're telling me about COVID-19, come on. So that's also a big problem, the lack of awareness. And then also balancing humanitarian needs and the COVID-19 measures. While it's extremely important to try to ramp up these COVID-19 measures, we also cannot forget about the basic humanitarian needs. Like, for example, that people need to move out for their livelihoods. We tried to decrease, for example, the movement out and in of the camps, but this is very hard to maintain. Also, relocation from reception centers needs to happen, of course, on a voluntary basis. So it's very important to balance those two. Now, this is the last slide, best practices in responding to these access challenges. So there are lots of response measures that we took for each one of these challenges, so it would take too long to go into details, but this in very broad lines. It's extremely important to create awareness on what actually humanitarian access means with partners and specifically with the field camp management, because also the camp managers sometimes are the first responders to those access challenges. Then to have proper reporting channels established whereby access incidents can be reported. This is part of this awareness effort. Then to have dedicated access capacity to support programming, like persons that really know what access means, what it entails, what it has to do with humanitarian principles. Also that access does not mean only humanitarian access to the affected population, but the affected population's access to the humanitarian assistance. And this is very important specifically for CCM also. And coordination within the access working group and with OCHA, because a lot of these cases can be only resolved, a lot of these access challenges can be only resolved on a higher level. Like, for example, when it's about restrictions of movements, when there are circulars or specific laws that are prohibiting movement, for example, then you need to have the OCHA advocacy. But for OCHA, it's extremely important, and also for the access working group, to have this input from the field. So when access incidents are happening on camp level, it's extremely important to have this communication and that it reaches also the OCHA level, access working group level, for advocacy purposes. Now, on the field level, and specifically also for CCM, continuous engagement with all the stakeholders, with local authorities especially, and here it's very important to develop a capacity for this engagement and also negotiation skills, and this is also something where the CCM role comes again into play, and the access awareness overall access awareness in programming, and here for the whole project cycle. So already in the project design phase, to have access, basically humanitarian access mainstreaming or access perspective, and to already recognize all these challenges and develop mitigation measures from the very start. I'm sorry if I took too long. It's a very broad subject, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Adnan. I know it's quite complex and challenging environment. I believe that for the sake of time, perhaps we can move on hearing from Victoria for the next part of Syria, and then we can take some comment or question. Okay, Victoria, are you there? Can I start sharing your presentation? Okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Veronica. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Well, as Veronica said, my name is Victoria. I'm the Sites and Settlements Working Group Coordinator for Northeast Syria. So essentially CCCM, but due to the political context and legalities, we go by SSWG. The SSWG is quite new. We've only been around for about 6 months now, and are slowly growing both in our presence and just coordination throughout NES. So for NES, when I speak about NES, it covers from the border with Iraq down to Deir ez-Zor, over to Raqqa and Manbij. We don't receive a lot of IDPs from the Northwest displacement, but we do receive some. Our IDP, our caseload includes, of course, refugees, mostly from Iraq, and then IDPs, as well as third country nationals who are very much in the news all the time, as I'm sure you're aware. Could I go to the next slide, Vero, if you don't mind? Thank you. And so just to give you a bit of a background, and Adnan covered a bit of it because the same resolutions that go through also impact the Northeast. And so most of our work is actually cross-border, which I am a part of the cross-border response, whereas there are agencies who are registered with Damascus and work in the official camps, whereas the informal camps are done mostly by the NES NGOs. So we've actually been, the NEST response has been remote probably since around October 9th, when the Turkish incursion into northeast Syria to establish the so-called safe zone happened mid-October. At that point, most of the international NGO international staff left, not so much for safety, but more to protect national staff, and because of the political context was so ambiguous. But slowly over that time, since then, most staff did return, and NGO activities were not impacted as far as implementation on the ground, because access was ambiguous for a few days, but fortunately the work was ongoing. And so with the COVID-19 response and the curfews that both SA and our border crossings with Iraq has imposed on our access and general response, there hasn't been a lot of major changes on the ground since we had already switched over to a remote management style and remote management type monitoring activities. What really sets NEST is that with very strong self-administration, with a very, very involved camp administration. So if we could go back to the second slide with the numbers, Vero. Okay, thank you. So we have 320 plus sites, settlements, and collective centers, and camp management presence is in about 11, 12, 15 of those sites. So most of those sites we are trying to cover through through partners who are willing to take on coordination responsibilities, or at least monitoring responsibilities, but also camp administration. So in our response, camp administration oftentimes does act as the front line for protecting this humanitarian space, though many of the times they're actually the ones that are crossing the red lines or allowing the red lines to be crossed. So within our caseload, we have about 120,000 individuals in our planned camps, which are the official camps based with Damascus-based NGOs, with some cross-border NGOs working in there, and then the informal camps, which are completely NEST NGOs. They are coordinated by a parallel coordination system, SSWG, and then the UNHCR counterparts. And we have been in conversation about how to harmonize standards across the two camps. The two partners for our camp management agencies cover those camps, as well as having active mobile teams throughout Northeast Syria. All right, Vera, could we go to the core challenges, which is the third slide? Yeah, thank you. So for our core challenges, ever since October 9th, we have had this overarching sentiment, and I think that a lot of us, no matter which response or the type of dynamics, have faced this before, is that you abandon us or you're not here. It happens, I feel like, with any sort of evacuation scenario or any scenario where security is poor and you're not able to be in the site all the time. And that has been a challenge with October, and that has been a challenge now with COVID-19, is where are you going? Why aren't you here? Even though we have 4,000 national staff who are consistently working and overcoming a lot of access challenges to be in our sites. And then another one is this parallel coordination structure. Again, because of the legal restrictions and political restrictions, oftentimes our parallel coordination structures cannot talk to each other, to the point that there's been threats and people have had visas revoked, and it's quite tricky. But because of the remote management situation, this is one, I guess not positive point, but we've been able to talk to each other a bit more because some of the political tensions have been mitigated. And then another one of our core challenges is, of course, the decentralization of our camp management and camp admin, camp administration. Because camp admins are quite autonomous and are not solely linked to an overarching structure, camp managers do have this opportunity to engage in in-depth capacity building and in-depth conversations that maybe wouldn't happen if you had to go through a larger hierarchy or larger bit of red tape. So here, that's one thing that we've really tried to do in our COVID-19 response, is to capitalize on that decentralization so we can set up site-level committees to bring these parties together and go step by step with site contingency planning, but also outlining the red lines and why it's important to actually keep these red lines. And then our other core challenge, of course, is that after October, some of the agreements that we had for our red lines, of course, people took a step back because there wasn't that international presence that was able to mitigate either threats against staff or just bring the force to some of these agreements. So we foresee this happening, of course, again with the COVID-19 response, and are trying through a more decentralized strategy to ensure that that does not happen again. And then, of course, another core challenge is mitigating any rising tensions in the camp. Most of the camps in NES are closed camps, so there's not a lot of freedom of movement in and outside, which of course does lead to rising tensions and therefore a greater militarization of the camps. The two camps
Sorry,
that
guys,
this particular...
Sorry, Victoria, we need to speed up a little bit more.
Okay, sorry. But the camp that this particularly happens in, I can't talk, we're not going to talk about it here just because it's in-depth and quite sensitive. So we can go to the next and last slide. All right, so what we've been trying to do is really focusing on building this response together so we can equally have stake in why we should protect humanitarian space, especially with camp admin, because camp admin does have this identity of we are humanitarians, we want to help, and they're much more open to defining the red lines with versus other non-state or state actors. So we've pushed most of the contingency planning and sort of advocacy paper development to the site level because it also gets it away more from the politics that can happen at coordination. And these committees that we've built are about 75% NGOs and CA and local authorities, and then about 30-40% actually local community members from our camp committees that we've been working with for a while. So those have been our main COVID-19 mitigation strategies. As far as things like shielding, which I know Adnan mentioned in some of these community IPC measures that camps are looking into implementing, we've also taken more of a community-based approach. So on shielding, for example, we've placed it in front of the community as this is part of the contingency planning that we're working on together. How can you protect your neighbor? How can you protect the person in Section A? Which is a question we both bring CA and local authorities in on. And so this draft can have just widestream acceptance. So, but our main questions as far as and considerations as we develop this this response is that since it does rely so much on national staff and on local partners, is that how do we further as remote management, how do we really support our national staff? Because their welfare, their well-being, and their understanding of the humanitarian principles, they're ultimately the ones saying, no, you can't cross that line to the potential perpetrator. So for us, that's been a key consideration of supporting them because they're our front line on this. So thank you. That's all from me, and happy to answer any questions here or bilaterally.
Thank you, Victoria. Let me see if there are some questions on a side. Yeah, I think that I mean, we can actually, before jumping to the other presentation, we can perhaps have sorry guys, can you mute your phone? Okay. So before I was saying that before jumping to the other presentation, perhaps we can hear a little bit from Tom Robinson, who is the Global Access Advisor with NRC. If you can give us a little bit of best practice based on the presentation coming from the Syrian context, the Northern Syrian context. Tom, are you with us?
Yep, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay.
So,
thanks a lot.
Go ahead.
Yep. Okay. First of all, hello to everybody who I know on here. There's a lot of familiar faces when I look down the list of people. Both really good presentations. It's really interesting to hear some of the measures you put in place already. Honestly, it's actually spoken a lot about what I would have said anyway as an access advisor. One of the big things is obviously how we mitigate losing our leverage and how we mitigate losing our presence, despite the lack of presence that is actually sort of unfolding in a lot of these contexts. And I think the ideas that are put forward by both Adnan and by Victoria just now have defined some clear things that need to be focused on. The main thing that I think that we are seeing, and definitely a worrying trend that we're trying to keep an eye on very closely at the moment on a global level, is the result of the lack of humanitarian footprint and what that's doing in terms of setting up norms for governments who may be more hostile towards humanitarians, creating these norms which make it much harder for us in the future to scale back up our operations. So this is the big concern for us that we're trying to mitigate through a number of different ways. Aside from what's been mentioned already, I think one of the main things to keep in mind is that remote engagement is not necessarily something that's a new concept. What is new is the fact that it's taking us by surprise. Normally, when we're trying to establish remote engagement, we have the time and the resources to put in our context analysis, to provide the right justifications, to do our risk analysis and look at our own capacities within the organization, function effectively, and to monitor our activities as well. That's obviously not the case when you have a sort of massive descaling of presence over a very short space of time. So what it kind of requires from us, I think, is to retroactively try and achieve some of these things which would be done under normal circumstances. So very much looking at your kind of stakeholder mapping, the people who your main sort of interlocutors and the key influencers and gatekeepers, making sure we have the best ways of communicating with these people, making sure we're using the right communication channels. This is nothing new to any of you. I mean, you're very much aware of this, but different modalities for different people. In relation to CCCM, I think the things Victoria and Adnan said were very, very good, making sure there's a focus on awareness of what access actually is, that it's a two-way system, that it's not just us accessing them, it's them being able to access the services, which is just as important as our access, which is becoming somewhat prohibited, obviously. The capacities as well that we have as organizations is one of the main things. Access is a very, very complicated thing. It's not just, it sounds very simple, but so much thought goes into maintaining, building and maintaining good access strategies. I've got a slide here which I'm not even going to try and show it because I'll mess it up. But it's a lot of stuff to think about. From what are your capacities? What is the role of the authority? Sorry. No,
we can share it also later on if you cannot be able to share it at the
absolutely.
moment.
I can share it in the chat or something as well. What is the role of the authority in the emergency? This is what has to be considered as well. Obviously, in different places, different actors take on different roles. The military obviously is a very big actor for a lot of these countries that we're working in. What are the risks of engagement? Victoria mentioned this. Knowing your organization's red lines is hugely important. But I think the most important point that Victoria mentioned actually was staff safety and the do no harm principle as well. This is something that is becoming a huge issue when the international presence, we say international presence, when the international staff or the foreign staff sort of leave, it's about maintaining that international presence, which means maintaining the set standards. It doesn't matter if you're a national staff member or not, it's just understanding what these standards are. And I feel often what we forget as internationals is that we don't have a clear delegation of authority after people have left an emergency or a situation. and that support to your 2ICs and to your national staff members or deputy camp managers or whoever has to be fundamental. And these lines of communication, the level of authority that is given has to be very, very clear. And these all have to be set down in clear guidelines of the organisation. There's a lot of different thoughts I have. I obviously don't want to take up much of your time, but if there are pressing issues, I'm happy to comment more.
Actually, yes, there is one question that you was raised in terms of the stakeholder analysis, because in most scenario we have OJA that should play a huge role also in stakeholder analysis, but then when it comes to liaising on a daily basis with local authority, there might be a little bit not captured in the general stakeholder analysis. So how would what would you suggest or recommend to camp managers wherever, like for example, they are starting a new, they're implementing a new project, they're building up a new camps, and they need to start to liaise with the authorities that perhaps they have no knowledge.
Yeah.
From where they should get information, what kind of communication strategy they should set up at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as you mentioned, this is, a lot of this stuff, especially when it comes to armed actor engagement, is something that SimCorp would normally lead on. Obviously, most of our efforts should go towards supporting that capacity and making sure that the coordination mechanisms are in place. But often you find, and something I'm very, very supportive of, is for individuals and organizations to take on their own degree of contextual understanding and analysis. This means getting out into the community as much as you can and understanding who the main influencers within that community are. Who are the people that have connections? Who are the people that know the context very well? And make sure you try to build professional relationships with these people and make sure your understanding is constantly updated. It's a very organic thing. You need to constantly be aware of what changes in sort of authority are taking place and who within the community represents the community's interest, but also who can be the interlocutors between you as a humanitarian organization and the authorities that are in place. There are really countless sources of information, and I'll share a resource with you guys afterwards on some of the basic steps when it comes to this level of engagement. But honestly, a lot of things that have been mentioned already, the setting up of committees, clear communication strategies, looking at how you physically communicate on the ground. Is it phones? Is it smartphone messaging? Is it Skype calls? Is it text messages? Is it whatever? Understanding which modality is the best way to communicate with people. But also making very clear what you're offering as an organization, what is the carrot that you carry, and what your roles and humanitarian mandate incorporate for them. How do we get a community to engage with us? I mean, the community is obviously aware that we are there to be providing support to those in need based on under the humanitarian principles. But the actors, the sort of authorities or armed actors in control need to understand this as well. And the first thing you do as an access person or as an emergency leader or whatever is to explain your operation, your mandate, and how it's driven by the humanitarian principles. And that has to be your sort of first way of sort of getting your foot in the door.
Thank you, Tom, for your intervention, and I'm sure we are going to have more questions for you. I think it's better if we just move to the next presentation, because also like Yemen and South Sudan have a very particular context. And actually, I'm already drafting a lot of questions for you, Bruno, so be ready after the two presentations. So Lauren, are you with us?
Hey, Vero, can you hear me?
Yes, I'm gonna share your presentation.
Thank you.
Here you go. Can you see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay,
great.
The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Vero. Thank you. So apologies for being late. I caught the tail end of what Tom was saying there. Now for Yemen, I'll give a very brief overview of the operational context and then some of the constraints forcing remote management situations, followed by some adaptations given the ongoing COVID-19 environment, and then some of our good practice that has worked in Yemen. So I'll focus primarily on the last two slides and just run through the first two pretty quickly here. Next slide, please. So in terms of the operational context, one of the key things I wanted to flag is just the diversity of IDP sites in terms of typology. So we have everything from pre-planned tented camps to unfinished buildings. And what this means is that the level of recognition from the authorities of the different IDP hosting sites varies significantly. The host community and IDP composition also is quite diverse across the country. In some areas, for example, along the west coast of Hodeidah and in Abs and Haja Governorate, we have a lot of IDPs who have been displaced, but to areas in which they had relatives previously. So this has meant relatively cohesive integration with host communities. In other areas, for example, in Laj Governorate in the south, eviction threats from landowners are pretty much constant. And that is one of the key access factors. So in some areas, and in Laj specifically, landowners have actually more power and authority than the local authorities that we rely on for mediation and that kind of thing. Generally, and this is both in the north and the south, but more so in the north, processes are highly bureaucratic, convoluted. They're at one point in the north, under the Houthi authorities, we had about 120 different directives. So we have a tracker for just about everything. I think there's about 10 different trackers in terms of access issues, directives, etc. And so we were tracking over 100 directives from the authorities to humanitarians. And the role of CCCM has been both essential from a coordination standpoint in terms of ensuring that services are provided efficiently in sites. And then it's also been relatively criticized depending on the day from our local authority counterparts. So in some senses, they do feel like they need us and that we have added value, but then in another breath, we are duplicating the role of the authorities. Next slide, please. So in the north, access is relatively intermittent, and it has forced remote site management and site support mechanisms in a number of areas. So in some senses, it's become a bit of the status quo. The south increasingly in the last several months has been more so mimicking their colleagues in the north with multiple and sometimes contradictory directives being issued from different levels of the authorities. We're also seeing quite a bit of fracturing, not just within the central authorities, but within their national security colleagues. And this really varies depending on shifts in alliances and the various politics within the country. So adapting to these is an ongoing challenge. One of the key impacts has been reduced implementation. So a lot of agencies now, especially as project sub-agreements are pending. At some point we had 80 sub-agreements pending in the country, and the sub-agreement is basically what gives an agency the ability to operate. So some partners have said, this is just not worth our time. We have money sitting in our bank and we cannot implement. So at a broader scale, a lot of these challenges have just meant that some of the highest needs areas are not receiving attention anymore. This was discussed, I think, in the guys speaking earlier, but there has tended to be a lack of red lines and challenges to coordinated decision making amongst humanitarians at a field level, but also at a senior level, country level. So this has changed in the last couple of months. There's been a lot of effort from country directors and above to advocate for a more principled operating environment. So this is changing, I would say, and we're kind of at a point now where a lot of decisions are being made in a relatively coordinated way. Next slide, please. Now, in the context of COVID, really we have, as site management, really just adapted our programming to be more focused on essential wash and shelter. We have integrated wash and shelter within our CCCM programs. So refocusing wash and shelter interventions, refocusing our community engagement on prevention and preparedness. And then we're also doing a couple of things such as community shielding, which we're in the preliminary stages of consultation and implementation. One thing to flag is that the COVID response has been an opportunity for local authorities to drive the response in line with their interests. We've seen this as well with flood responses, the kind of propagating of an emergency rhetoric to pull humanitarians, to guilt them, and to suggest that there are emergency needs and humanitarians are doing nothing. So the current and ongoing COVID response is no exception to that. But at the same time, we have used this to our advantage, and we have used the pretext of COVID and the actual needs associated with the COVID risks to negotiate our access, and this has been successful on a small scale. Obviously, we are going to see externally imposed restrictions due to the virus risk, as well as our organizational policies in terms of duty of care and ensuring that our staff are not posing risks, particularly to highly vulnerable people in IDP sites. Ensuring that we have community focal points in place and that we're using them and training them is going to continue to be key to our programming. Our coordination focus has shifted mostly to essential service provision and ensuring that partners have in place continuity plans, and that the health crisis or another access issue is not going to be a reason to stop programming. In some situations, the access restrictions imposed as a result of COVID are somehow a new challenge. But in Yemen, we really have no excuse to not have adapted programming for access constrained situations. It really is the norm. So we need to be learning and preparing better. Like I said, it's been relatively straightforward shifting our program because we have the integrated wash and shelter, and we have our communication channels and strategic community engagement and communication. So it's really been about refocusing and retargeting on the COVID response. And as I mentioned, we are exploring community shielding as a way that we think is very important to protect the high risk in certain site settings, depending on shelter and site typology. This requires really extensive community engagement and training of community focal points. One, because it needs to be a community-driven intervention, but two, because if and when access becomes constrained in our key areas as a result of COVID or as a result of other security issues, we need for these mechanisms and the knowledge to be existing within the community. Next and final slide, please. Okay, so just a list of practice that has worked for us to flag this. These are not recommended everywhere. Even within Yemen, we're kind of picking and choosing what is appropriate depending on, say, the relationship with the authorities and also depending on the practice of other partners. Obviously, nothing like this, especially related to incentives, as all CCCM people are aware of, can be highly sensitive if you're not well coordinated, and you can really do harm to other partners' implementation. So utilizing and building capacity of site committees is huge, especially in anticipation of a remote management situation. I think, as Tom mentioned, sometimes we don't have the time to prepare, but I mean, I also feel like we sometimes use that as a bit of an excuse. Generally, one of the key principles of CCCM that we would all agree is encouraging ownership and building these skills within the community. So access constraints and COVID should just be a reason to amplify these key principles. Incentives generally, especially in our sites, in our IDP sites in the north, in Abs and Haja, we lost access to 4 of our key sites in July of last year due to increased militarization of the area. One of the key ways that we continue to maintain contact and communication with our focal points there is by providing incentives, primarily phone credit, but we're also doing things like transporting them or providing a transport allowance so that they can come to a more central non-militarized area for training and that kind of thing. So this is something we were practicing even before we lost access. But one of the key lessons learned as we were expanding our site coverage was invest in committees from the beginning, have them taking ownership over their activities so that when you rely on them, it's not going to be a major shift. Remote distributions, the picture on the last slide actually was a picture of a checkpoint distribution. Again, I'm not suggesting this takes place everywhere, but this was at a checkpoint, basically the last checkpoint that we can access in Northern Abs before entering the militarized area. So when we receive notification from our community focal points there of new arrivals or say of a shelter fire, we are basically bringing shelter materials or NFIs or RM kits to this checkpoint and having someone on the other side come and transport. So that type of adapted remote distribution modality has been very useful, and it has maintained an element of trust in the site and a recognition that DRC is still operating. Again, next point, potentially controversial, but we have, at least in the north, we have Scumcha, or from the Houthi authorities, we have focal points which they have selected integrated within our site committees. This has really encouraged transparency, and generally we haven't had issues with that being that role being manipulated. So that has worked for us in certain areas. Community-based activities, ensuring that within our sites people have the skills and the motivation to identify issues within their site and to propose actions and then determine how we can support. So in the same sites that we lost access to and that we were doing remote distributions, we also have done community-based activities where we are delivering, for example, materials to repair a school, and then the community and members of the committee are responsible for the construction. That kind of thing to ensure that they are still monitoring the site and ensuring that standards are still upheld, but that there is an element of volunteerism to that. And also that DRC, as the CCCM agency, is still there to support. Relationships with authorities at a local level have been huge. Even when we've been blocked at a SANA level, for example, we have negotiated access at a Haja level, and this has allowed us to continue operating to some extent. Integration of hard programming. As I mentioned, we have an integrated wash and shelter program under our site management, and this has been critical. So even if authorities are of the mind that CCCM is a duplication of the role of the authorities, if we lead with we have 200 shelters or 500 latrines to construct and be a bit more discreet about what CCCM is, we've had success with that approach. I'm not suggesting that this is the right approach always, and that could be considered a red line for some countries and some agencies in terms of not being fully transparent about what are your goals as a humanitarian organization. But that is something we've done. We've worked through contractors in inaccessible areas. Again, not ideal, but especially in militarized areas, it has allowed us to, for example, ensure that water provision is up to standard. And then remote coordination modalities. This has been a tough one, especially with the current COVID environment. We have excellent area-based coordination focal points and project managers in 3 key areas across Yemen, and they've all found relatively effective ways to maintain communication and coordination with their partners. Again, it's an ongoing struggle, so by no means have we found the effective coordination recipe, but by maintaining regular communication, by being very clear about action points, and by just generally maintaining a positive coordination environment, we've had relative success in remote coordination We have a remote coordination tool, which is basically like an action point tracker. And the idea is that when you are not able to have meetings, say because of COVID, because the internet is not strong enough for a WebEx meeting, you can at least track and circulate coordination action points to encourage accountability amongst partners. Thanks, Vero. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Lauren. Aptly said. I can only imagine the kind of challenges you guys go through from what I see on TV. And I know the colleagues would want to ask many questions, but the task group will provide this opportunity even outside this webinar. But for now, I would love to hear two concerns from the rest of the participants. Two concerns or questions. Anyone have a question? Does anyone have a question? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Ronald, we can. I think we can just move ahead because I have some questions.
Question from Amel in the chat.
Oh, yes.
Over.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
I guess it's directed at me. So the question is, how is the acceptance of the community shielding? Very good question. Generally, one of the key findings of DRC's shielding intervention to date is a family or extended family only shield. So this is important to flag that we are not promoting or implementing a sector or a site level community shield, family and extended family only. So this took a little bit of learning, but generally because of Yemeni tradition and culture, we don't think any higher level of shield or green zone would be feasible or effective. Generally, the acceptance of this family level approach has been very positive. We've done a pilot in some areas on the West Coast and in ABS, as I've mentioned, and the reception from the community has been really positive. There is a general interest in protecting the high risk. That's how we're leading the conversation. Do you understand who is at high risk? Do you understand how they can be protected and why it's important to protect the high risk? So we've definitely learned a lot in terms of how best to engage and communicate with the communities on this. But to date, the feedback has been very positive. And we're working now on basically rolling it out so that everyone in our sites has, one, has the information, and two, potentially has piloted the shielding arrangement, or three, is aware and has committed to the shielding arrangement and is prepared to activate it upon trigger of the imminent risk of COVID in the area. So this is our goal. I'm happy to discuss community shielding more extensively, but potentially in another forum. I can share with Vero actually all of the resources that DRC has developed basically to facilitate the community engagement at a site level, at a household level, how to conduct a pilot, various considerations and tools and guidance. So I can share all that with Vero if of interest.
Yes, indeed, it will be very interesting. And I guess so. Something that we would like to highlight that at the end of the webinar, then we will collect some material. So Tom was mentioning there was some useful material that we can use in our operation, or at least we can be used to get some more information how to best set up also a communication strategy and how we can best engage with the community, state and non-state actors. So yes, please flag to us any things relevant. We will share. And Ronald, yes, I think we should move to the last presentation because then I would like to ask some question to Bruno. Yeah, actually quite a lot of questions coming for protection colleagues. So Ronald, can we
definitely
start?
Mahmoud, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready, please.
Veronica, can we have the presentation online?
Yes. Hold on.
Mahmoud, please go ahead.
Okay, can you see it?
Okay, so good evening to everyone. As Tom mentioned, there are lots of familiar people here, so hi to everyone. Let me start with the operational context. Now, in South Sudan, since 2013, we have experienced unprecedented displacement and extremely high level of humanitarian needs. An estimated of 1 million people returned from the displacement in South Sudan or from the neighboring countries. And we also have nearly 4 million people remain displaced and more than 2.2 million as refugees. Now, despite the signing of the peace agreement in September 2018, the communal conflict and the clashes continue to be the main drives of displacement across the country. Now, with the COVID-19 pandemic, has presented additional challenges to the delivery of services by CCCM or other operational partners. And this includes the negative sentiments and the threats to the humanitarian service providers and the movement restrictions of the humanitarian staff, assets, and goods or provisions. Now, as you may know, the displacement crisis led to the creation of the POCs in South Sudan. However, service-related challenges inside the POCs have sometimes led to access restrictions for humanitarian organizations and staff in South Sudan. And by announcing the first case of COVID-19 in 5th of April, the emergence of anti-UN sentiment consequently led to the implementation of movement restrictions for all UN and non-UN staff across the country. And now so far we have recorded 52 cases in South Sudan, where while we believe there are lots of other cases maybe have not been diagnosed or maybe recorded so far in South Sudan, which is remain unpredictable. Moving to the slide number 3, the implementation challenges. Now, both staff and humanitarian agencies were required to secure COVID-19 free certificates in order to travel from the capital Juba to the states, which has been lifted luckily 2 days ago, and now the people are able to move within the states. With the COVID-related restriction as well has slightly affected or let's say highly affected, so the delivery of services in POCs and camp-like settings. Now, all CM daily routine activities were completely suspended until further notice to ensure the preventive measures. Also, the lockdown measures have hindered the mobile CCCM responses in the formal sites and the hard-to-reach areas, both due to the COVID-19 and to the approaching of the rainy season, where most of the roads will be inaccessible in South Sudan. In terms of challenges related to the, like we are facing in maintaining the humanitarian or civilian character of the camps, is the government implementation of the lockdown measures and the movement restrictions, which have involved sometimes in some POCs like in Juba and Malakal, involved the placement of police at the gates of POCs in areas outside where it should be designated as a weapon-free zone. This also faced in Malakal and Juba. And other challenges faced in addressing these issues were the negative sentiments and the perceptions that the humanitarians are the one who is responsible in spreading the COVID-19 in South Sudan. That due to the first case announced was to a UN staff at Juba level. Also, the existing community myths surrounding the COVID-19. Lots of people in South Sudan believe COVID-19 only infects the white people. Some people believe that COVID-19 infects women only. And some believes that South Sudan have witnessed lots of wars and lots of challenges, and therefore God will never bring COVID-19 to South Sudan. So these kind of myths are actually a very critical challenge for us to address through our communication channels. Also, despite all these CCCM efforts, the lack of adequate spaces to allow effective or physical distancing inside the sites remain a major factor for possible community transmission in the near future. There are extra challenges we are foreseeing with the COVID-19 responses, is the decongestion of the POCs and the facilitation or support of the spontaneous return together with the approaching of the rainy season. Also, we have most of the CCCM actors and the operational partners operating under skeleton staff. Most of the staff being evacuated or they are operating from Juba level. Also, in ensuring the smooth running of service provision with the congestion of the POCs and the lack of manpower. One of the major things is the transportation of health supplies from the to the field locations by the health partners. Also, the lack of capacity among the health partners to respond to the COVID-19. Now, so far there are a few maybe extra facilities established in maybe Malakal or maybe Juba. In Bentiu, so far we don't have any extra facility to either used as a holding facility or a treatment facility for COVID-19, where everyone relying on the capacity of the Ministry of Health to address the COVID-19, where we all know the Ministry of Health do not really has the capacity to address that. Also, the staff safety and security. After this negative sentiments and the threats, most of our staff at the field level operating, or they are from the POC themselves. So these kind of threats will definitely hinder the smooth running of operation. Also, now since we are considering the lockdown scenarios, the management of the staff or the team during the lockdown scenario or the expected outbreak within the POCs would be definitely a challenge, as I mentioned, because most of the staff are actually living inside the POCs. Also, the community customs, the traditions, the local norms we have in South Sudan. There are groups of in the POC, they will feel offended or maybe insulted by not shaking hands or hugging or maybe continue with your normal traditions. So this is also another challenge. Now, there are lots of measures we are working on. Some of these measures like developing the POC contingency plans. Now, we have two contingency plans for each POC, is one for the normal one and one for the COVID-19 across all the camps. The team rotation plans we have put in place to make sure to ensure the preventive measures on the ground. Also, establishing a remote management tools to ensure the smooth running of all the life-saving activities and the monitoring of the critical humanitarian services. Now, moving to the last slide, please. The best practices and recommendations. The continuous of liaison and the communication. You know, CCCM as a key member of the UNMISS and Humanitarian COVID-19 Task Force engages in access negotiation with the local actors through the state government-led COVID-19 task force in order to ensure the civilian character of the environs of, for example, Malakal POC, which was really successful over there. Also, the fostering of our culture of communication with the communities to enhance the remote management of sites by continuing the remote implementation, like the CFM desk, the arbitration of the key concerns, and the establishing raising needs, and so on. Also, the CCCM advocacy on access to the ICCG, HCT, the COVID-19 National Task Force, the high-level task force, and the government at the national level. As well as, lastly, the risk communication and community engagement strategies we're having on the ground. We have tools to track all the messages, all the rumors or misinformation in order to be debunked on timely manner, in order to reinforce our CCCM information and dissemination strategy across the POCs in South Sudan. So that's it from me, and I'm happy to receive any questions if any, please.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. Is there, let me check
Thank
if
you,
there is any
Mahmoud.
question. Not from my side, but I have actually a question for Bruno. So, Bruno, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So, considering actually the last two presentations, it seems to me that there is that our beneficiaries are also expressed concern over not only the increasing presence of military armed actor in the ground, but also like about the outbreak. So the first question coming from you is how can we best communicate? How can we best communicate with the affected community and address their concern relating to the outbreak?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. That's Bruno Stolze. I'm from the protection cluster in Iraq. And I think communications with communities was also, I was glad to see as an important feature in the presentations that preceded, but also in Iraq has been a massive intake, and I'll explain a bit why. But indeed, ensuring communication, but not only in terms of informing the affected community, but ensuring that it's a two-way communication, I think it's crucial. So I think the aim of the communication should not only be at informing, which is an important element, but should not be a limit in itself, but should also aim at collecting and responding to the feedback and concerns that are expressed by the affected community. I think, as Tom said, remote management and remote communication is not necessarily a new concept. I think what indeed has been striking is how we have to rapidly adapt to it in contexts where that may not have been a reality in the past. And that has also, in the communication side, posed additional challenges because some of the traditional methods that we were used to communicate with the community now are challenged. So in Iraq, for example, communities have traditionally reported preference for communication face-to-face, which is not necessarily an option these days. So when this is not an option, it's really important to understand what are the additional ways that communities would want to use to ensure that two-way communications. We have carried out several assessments where communications with communities and AAP, accountability to affected populations, is a feature, an important feature of the assessments to try to understand and readapt our communication methodologies. Some of the areas that we are considering is messaging through Mukhtars and sector leaders and camp committees, which was raised before in the presentations, loudspeakers or megaphones used by humanitarian teams on a schedule-based or mosque loudspeakers, which can be done in coordination with leaders. Social media messaging, Facebook and WhatsApp groups in some contexts may also work, particularly in formal settlements. Bulk messaging. We are in Iraq. We have an Iraq Information Center, which is a project that allow humanitarian actors to contact a large number of IDPs. So that's an area that we can also look at. And if the operational environment allows, a bit of individualizing door-to-door messaging or poster leaflets, if that's a communication that it's accessible to people, because we also need to understand levels of literacy and understanding of the message through those means. I think the first point would be that, and understanding, so it's nothing new, understanding these entry points. I think that these can also lead to, or at least support behavioral change at the different levels. I have come across, for example, COVID-19 handbook on how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic from an Islamic perspective. I don't know if it's trustworthy, but I see that there are efforts to try to understand how the preventive and mitigation measures can be aligned with traditional practice or religious beliefs. So maybe looked into how religious actors or community leaders can take on some of those preventive measures and frame it in a way that it's more accessible to the population. So I think that's also something to be considered. And as some actors may have better access, I think the COVID-19 brings a better position for some WASH and health actors. Other actors, including CCCM, should coordinate with them and ensure that their voice is leading to a unified effort in communications with communities. If possible, maybe join teams, as they may be better placed to grant access to other actors. Obviously, depends on the context. I think another element that we need to consider very carefully when dealing with the COVID-19 situation is about addressing questions and rumors and misinformation in the sites. And this should be a very strong component on the remote management context, meaning establishing close links with the people on the ground, ensuring that those rumors or those questions are addressed by the humanitarian actors and by community committees or outreach workers that may exist in the site, because these should be influencing how we convey the message, but also adapting as the rumors or the misinformations arise. And one thing, at least on the Iraq context, I cannot respond to others. One thing that we have been really clear is on the messages that are conveyed and how it needs to be approved and liaised with the health authorities on the ground and with the humanitarian health actors, WHO, for example. So it's a very sui generis situation. Messaging could lead to compliance or non-compliance of measures. So it's very important that we have a unified voice, and that comes with the technical expertise that it requires. I don't know if I addressed your question, but I'm happy to elaborate if needed.
Very well. Actually, that would be very interesting also to receive or read this handbook about that address a little bit the concern relating to the COVID and the best practices also linked to their cultural behavior, in that case the Islamic religious.
Sure.
There is also
I
another...
can share with you. Just for the record, I don't know how trustworthy the source is, so please read with a bit of salt. Maybe it's just because I haven't had the time to look at it. Over.
Okay, point well taken. And there was also a follow-up question for you that is mostly relating to, so as we mentioned, as we see in this presentation, we have an increased number of military actors in and around the camps, which is raising concerning. So how can we best monitor that the civilian character of camps is respected by local authorities? And are there tools available that could be applied in remote management for monitoring, as I say, that civilian character of camp are respected? There is any example that you would like to share with us?
I'm sure, and I see on the list of participants that there are some colleagues from Iraq, so please feel free to correct, bring your perspective, or challenge somewhat what I will say, because some of you have actually engaged in the tool that I'm going to be talking about. But indeed, maintaining or ensuring the civilian and humanitarian character of sites is an important consideration that should guide from the establishment of the site itself but throughout the maintenance of the site. So I'm not going to be talking about the preventive and mitigation measures at the initial phases. I think there are some literature that spells out the role of both states and humanitarian actors. I can share with you guys some resources. I can name, for example, the ICRC, UNHCR, Ed Memoir with operational guidance on maintaining the civilian and humanitarian character of sites and settlements. You have a UNHCR guidance note on the same topic, which is tailored for asylum, but can be used by analogy for the IDP context. And they will elaborate a bit more on the screening, separation, disarmament fronts, which I wouldn't see any. Obviously, the challenges that access constraints may bring are still applicable to these cases, but I think you can still carry out your role of monitoring and advising from a remote perspective if you have actors in loco that can support you on that. So I'm going to focus more as situations that Vero just mentioned when camps are established and weapon bearers, be it local police, security forces, or non-state armed groups, increase presence on the site. And it is indeed crucial to monitor those cases and look at ways to advocate for the upholding of the principle. I think the challenge is how to do it. And Tom, and I'm sorry, the colleague from Yemen and northeast Syria touched upon a bit the experience on the linkages with actors on the ground. From the Iraq perspective, what we found at the beginning was it was very difficult to engage in discussions about civilian character of camp because there was an assumption that it was, or at least in speech, that it was isolated events and did not constitute a trend, nor an event that was worrisome. So for that purpose, the Protection and Ccm cluster developed a tool to track the civilian character of the camps. It's a COBO tool that is therefore available online and offline. Can be used by any humanitarian actor operating on the site. So we try to simplify the tool not to have protection language that it's really not understood by some other actors. It's a tool that it's available in the local language, so it will allow humanitarian actors, both international and locals, to use the tool. And it evolved us to understand the situation on specific camps, understand whether there were camps that were more problematic or others, because of maybe the interactions between the humanitarian actors on the ground and local authorities or not. And the idea was that these would be analyzed on a quarterly basis and would underpin our advocacy efforts. It would bring really clear indications on what are the incidents that are happening on the ground, what are the main areas where we need to focus our attention because there are specific concerns on that area, and would allow us to also understand the quality of the data because it can be reported, although it's to be used by humanitarian actors, we allowed the information that it's included to be both coming from IDPs through the humanitarian actors as well as the humanitarian themselves who may have witnessed some of the incidents. So the idea was really to understand the breach of the principle of the civilian and humanitarian character of the camp and support on our advocacy. It's important to note, though, that it was never intended to have to be a first response tool, because that required specific, concrete, and immediate actions from the cluster. So it was complementary, and it was more for our advocacy efforts. But it has helped us to engage on a more structured manner discussions with security forces, but also with other different stakeholders like donors on issues related to civilian character of the camp. So if you want, Tom just shared the last quarterly report. I'm also sharing with you on the chat the tool itself. It's a node link, so feel free to use. And if you want, I can also share with you a bit of the, I don't know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so that's the quarterly report. So basically you understand a bit what are the trends in terms of incidents. We would then analyze the trends as they progress, whether there is an increase, a decrease. We will also cross-check with other reporting mechanisms, like first response mechanisms that clusters may have established. And then it would allow different stakeholders to report. So if you see here on the bottom left, you have the reporting partners, and Protection and CCCM have traditionally constituted most of the source. We also enabled partners who want to submit information anonymously, and then it will come to the second level where we would really break down the categories of the violation. So the presence of armed actors in the camp, just wandering around market areas would already constitute a violation per se. Then detention, mistreatment of IDPs, etc. the issue here is CCCM would provide the technical tools and would facilitate a lot of the training and a lot of the groundwork. And the protection cluster was the one responsible for analyzing the data and converting it into something that is still somehow aligned with protection considerations, but readable to a wider audience. So humanitarian actors would just list the incident, and then at the data cleaning process, we would reread the incidents and understand whether the categories that were selected by the humanitarian actors did constitute what they have mentioned. So, for example, people could say that could click torture as a violation, but the narrative had not the different elements that torture requires to be classified as such. That will be the protection cluster reclassifying a bit the violations, and then we worked to improve a bit reporting with partners on the ground. We also, one important consideration that helped us with the engagement with authorities is that we do have a presumption of innocence in the reporting tool, which means that if the partner doesn't include enough elements that for us constitute a violation, we would not consider it to be a violation. And that was a decision that we took in order to avoid that the tool itself is questioned by authorities and that we can have reliable information to argue with them on the incidents. It also did not include biodata of IDPs, as you can see from the link that I shared, and that's to ensure the protection of affected populations as such. So I don't know if it's something that I shared the link with you, and something that we can also discuss bilaterally if you think it's useful. Over.
Thank you so much, Bruno. That actually was very useful for us. And I believe that, as you mentioned, that also like local partners, consider there is a remote management at the moment ongoing, and we can also train and capacitate a little bit also partners that are local NGOs well that are working with us. And this is actually could be a great tool, something that, for example, we need for Syria. This I can tell for sure. So, okay, I guess now we are almost at the end, so last 5 minutes before. And I want to ask to any of the participants if they have some question they would like to raise. This is your moment. Anyone? Luigi?
It's Tom again. I'd like to ask a question, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Great. Firstly, that was a really interesting tool on the CCCM and armed actors being involved there. I think that would have been, yeah, I don't know how long that's been in existence in Iraq, but it's really, really impressive to see it. But also it's something to keep in mind with the sort of quarantine sites that are popping up now as well. It's kind of a useful thing for that. What I was going to say was, yeah, so we spoke earlier about some of the perceptions and the negativity that's coming out from some of the regions. We know we've been, like I said before, we've been tracking a number of these incidents happening, and it's really becoming a bit of a trend that's concerning for the future, sort of access and longer term acceptance. We know that there's sort of different local authorities and government authorities are sort of reinforcing these trends quite a bit, especially in places like Yemen, South Sudan, and Iran, and Nigeria. I mean, there's a lot of places where it's happening. But in terms of people's experience here, what are you seeing these perceptions really being enforced within the community, or is it mostly just at the authority level that the negative attitude is sort of being made obvious?
Lauren, Mahmoud, Victoria, would you like to take this question?
Sorry, Tom, would you mind repeating the question? My connection went out.
Basically, just if the sort of negativity towards organisations is coming from the authorities, or if it's also being perpetuated within communities as well. I know South Sudan is an example of where it's in the community too, but Yemen, for example, we're seeing news articles which are placing blame on NGOs for certain things or organisations, but is it being perpetuated within the community, this feeling of negativity?
For Northeast, I would say it's mostly from local authorities. At first, it was with the community, but I think we made a lot of efforts to go to the sites as frequently as possible, to walk around, to have teams walking around. So after that, that did mitigate a lot of the feelings. And then with local authorities, it has honestly declined a bit. And I think with COVID-19, the feeling hasn't been stirred up as much as in October. But that's also because we've been very consistent in explaining how our teams work, and also in doing a lot of Skype calls all the time with authorities. And we learned a lot of lessons from October on that front.
Great. Thanks, Victoria.
Well,
Yemen, for example, anybody?
May I respond from South Sudan?
Please, Mahmoud.
Go ahead, Mahmoud.
Yeah, please. For South Sudan, I think from both, from the from the local authorities and the community as well. I mean, it was a little bit political when the first case was announced. The first case was arrived to South Sudan on 28th of April. If I'm not mistaken, then she has been diagnosed with the COVID in like after 1 month of arriving to South Sudan. So most likely she has gotten the virus while being in South Sudan. But then the way it has been announced and maybe published to the public was like it's the first case with the UN with the UN staff. So this also triggered lots of threats in the social media. Lots of people were thinking of maybe attacking the UN staff in the streets, and this is why there was a grey alert announced in South Sudan, and therefore it was a very dangerous material. Or let's say announcement to be done in such context. So far, the threats we're receiving, or the negative sentiment from both the local authorities and the community as well.
Awesome, thanks.
And I can add for Yemen. I mean, generally, the animosity towards...
Sorry, Lauren, we cannot hear you very well.
Is that better?
No.
Oh, she's being scrambled.
No.
You sound like a
Lauren.
robot, Lauren.
Yes.
Hello?
No, Lauren, we cannot hear you well.
Hello, guys.
Hello.
I thought I had my name, but you came in broken.
Is that better?
Can you please
Yes,
repeat?
Yes, much
totally.
Okay.
Yes, this is better now.
Sorry. So I was just saying, primarily most animosity towards humanitarians has been based on the interest of and the agenda of the authorities. But there has been a number of instances where the authorities have used and taken advantage of beneficiary communities to, kind of do their dirty work and forward their agenda. So we have seen a lot of that, and we've been sort of the targets of it as DRC. We have challenges directly from the community, but a lot of that is based on the inadequate communication on beneficiary criteria or exclusion of host community. And we don't have that more kind of systemic or sort of mistrust or resentment that was being described in Northeast Syria. So yeah, generally it is the local authorities, but I would suggest that a lot of our kind of highly vulnerable communities are quite vulnerable to being used by the authorities, depending on their agenda.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Lauren. Okay, guys, I think it's more than an hour and a half that we are here, and I guess it's our moment to wrapping up. First of all, I would like to really thank all of you for participating to this first webinar, and I hope that has been very useful for you. And we were thinking with Ronald that maybe we can have a next round in a few weeks. But yes, I would like to hear actually your input as well, and if you think that has been valuable. Ronald, would you like to say anything?
Yes, Veronica, thank you. Thank you, colleagues. It's been a hard one putting this together. I know we had to scramble some of you over the last 24 hours. We apologize for that. But this has provided a very good setting for future collaboration and experience sharing amongst us. Now, this is not necessarily limited to CCCM actors alone. We hope that as we get stronger in this investigation and interrogation of the challenges we have, we can co-opt other actors like Tom and Bruno. Thank you, Tom and Bruno. It's great that you've shared this kind of information with us. And definitely, let's take the opportunity to reach out to each other, but above most to myself and Veronica on how you want this to move forward. The one thing that we hoped would have been discussed today, but we realized would have taken a lot of time, are the terms of reference of this task group. Now we have a draft put together, but we cannot share that out as a finished product because there need to be some input from the rest of you. So at some point in time, we're going to share this with you with the support of SAG and the two colleagues, Jennifer and one in Geneva. But it's been a great discussion. I've tried to take some notes. Let's hope we can put something together for your consumption later. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.